Thank you. Good evening. The project I'm going to talk about is the Craigieburn Bypass. Most of you would probably know it because you've probably driven past it or underneath this bridge. The project came about because of Vic Road's desire to create a new gateway to the north of Melbourne. It evolved out of an expression of interest where 30 consortiums put together to express their interest to compete in a shortlisted competition where 4 were shortlisted to go forward and come forward with ideas. One of the great things about design competitions for people in our industry is that you get to choose who you work with. And it's a bit like being a kid at playtime. You can choose who you get to play with your friends, and you get to have fun for a short period of time. And so for this competition, we put together a team. A friend of mine, Peter Tonkin, is an architect in Sydney with TZG, and Robert Owen, who's quite a famous sculptor here in Melbourne. And all the other specialists, sound engineers, structural engineers, acoustic engineers, and so on, that we required to advise us on how to make our ideas come true. So the brief from Vic Roads was to propose design concepts for noise attenuation walls and a suitably impressive gateway element to Melbourne's northern entry. They'd allocated around $25 million for the walls and set aside a $5 million budget for a gateway element. The bypass itself was 17 kilometres long. Effectively, it bypasses the Hume, the red line shown there on the plan, and most of the noise walls were in the southern section, a total of about 5 kilometres. This was one of the 4 entry panels we put in for the design competition. And I must say at this point, when we got shortlisted to be one of the 4 competitors, we were so excited we didn't even expect to win. We were just rapt to get to that point. And perhaps, and maybe in retrospect, our naivety worked in our favour because we could concentrate on concepts and ideas rather than getting lost in trying to solve some of the complex functional requirements of Vic Roads. Our first thought was to reject the notion of a singular gateway. Instead, we combined the budgets of the noise walls and the gateway to create one broader effect. The intention was to provide high-quality architectural features for the length of the bypass that would be sequential as a sequential gateway and to be experienced not as a standalone singular item. We wanted to blur the boundaries between what were functional noise walls, sculpture, and gateway elements. And our interest lay in the composition of these, how they work together, the idea of narrative, the possibility that you can tell a story of a landscape within a built structure or along a road, and that how these things, these static objects, could actually start to exhibit some dynamism or be articulated by the travelling motorist going past. We believe the project should be seen as part of a language of thresholds arriving into Melbourne. You know, there's the very well-known entry coming in from Eastlink, designed by DCM. There's also the not so famous but definitely very long and memorable approach from the east as you come through all the suburbs. But arriving to Melbourne from the north, you're coming down the Hume over a series of grasslands and small hills, each hill after the other revealing just the next hill in front, more grass, more grass, more grass, until finally you come over the last hill and then all of a sudden all of Melbourne is revealed in front of you. It's one of the few, I guess, approaches to a city where the city is completely hidden until one point where the landscape completely reveals it in its entirety. So the iconography of the Hume Highway, we didn't want to ignore that as the last leg of the conduit that connects Sydney to Melbourne. And that this bypass obviously terminates that journey, but at the same time, it marks the point of departure going back the other way. And I guess also quite nice that we chose to work with an architect from Sydney and a landscape architect from Melbourne to collaborate, and it was a true collaboration, to come up with one concept that would achieve what Vic Roads were putting forward. So just to roughly explain the context, this diagram shows the blue line coming from the top of the page down is the proposed alignment for the bypass. On the west is the ancient basalt plains of Victoria, the Craigieburn grasslands, and also the Merri Creek catchment, the Merri Creek being the squiggly line. And then on the far side is the Hume Highway and its associated industry. And on the east, effectively, what the proposed alignment that Vic Roads were putting forward really hugged quite closely to the expanding eastern fringe of the city, and in this case it was Thomastown. So you can see here in this photograph the houses of Thomastown, the sort of mown strip running through the grass is the proposed road alignment, and then that far expanding field of native grassland, which was only, I think, one of the remaining 1% area of native grassland of Victoria. So the design was essentially born out of the desire to express the relationship between the freeway and these two extremely opposing conditions, one of the grassland and one of suburbia. And the two edges, or the two edge conditions, gave rise to two sculptural wall types. And we gave the walls nicknames. We called one the curtain and one the scrim. I should just go back. This sort of caricature is just sort of picking up where we use the curtain wall to accentuate where you saw the view of Melbourne and to sort of, in a way, frame Melbourne or use these walls as a gateway element. And there, when we got closer down to Thomastown, the second wall type, the scrim, we used to deal with the higher wall requirements much closer to the housing. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the two wall types. The first being the curtain wall. It was designed to be a travelling companion for a lot of the route, appearing at key moments along the road where noise attenuation was required, but also where you got that key view of Melbourne. It had to serve as a noise attenuation device, but also a transforming edge that merged into different forms and functions along its route. We wanted to create something that was free and fluid, the sense that it sort of moved next to you as you drove along. And at competition stage, what we were looking at was a composition of fabricated steel sheets that were lifted off the ground sitting on a concrete base, and that concrete base was continuous then on with a scrim wall. It was designed as a screen, but also designed as part of a landform. And then ultimately, as that movement became, I guess, the frequency increased to the point where it felt as if the steel freed itself from its base, jumped the road, became a bridge, and framed that view of Melbourne. At the same time, that bridge that the wall became by jumping over the road linked two pieces of public land. It linked the Whittlesea Gardens and the grasslands on the other side. So in designing the wall, we need to make sure that both the driver experience and the pedestrian experience were equally important and needed to be equally considered. So this is the built outcome, the steel wall freeing itself from its base, jumping over the road, forming a link between two public spaces, and framing that key view of Melbourne as you arrive from that long drive from Sydney. One of the quick sketches we did trying to work out, well, you know, how does this form work and how do we relate the grasslands to the Whittlesea Gardens? And then this image of the built outcome. Now, just while we're on this image, what you can see in the far distance, the blue elements and a strip of white, this is where the second wall type, the scrim, came into play. This is where the road alignment came much closer to the houses. In some cases, the walls were only 25 to 30 metres from the back fences of the properties. And some of the noise attenuation heights required were up to 12 and 13 metres. So given that they're on the western side of the house, overshadowing was a big issue. So as the name suggests, the idea of a scrim, we wanted it to be light and translucent. It needed to satisfy the objectives that it should be considered not only a driving experience, but also for those of the residents, and that we needed to reduce the effect of overshadowing. We were interested in the material language of the suburbs and how we could transform this to a grand scale. You know, the idea of windows and screens and louvers, all of these domestic things that sit behind this wall. The design itself is composed of basically an acrylic linear screen and a rhythm of vertical louvers. The vertical louvers were precast concrete and painted blue. The louvers allowed light, or this allowed light in reducing overshadowing, with the louvers opening and closing views to the acrylic wall behind. The composition of the elements, whilst the concrete elements are, or these blue louvers are static and singular, they rotate or they're set on a slight different axis from one to the other, so that it creates an illusion of spin at speed, a constant opening and closing of the view to the wall behind. And this, during the process of designing it, this was, I guess, one of the fun things about investigating design and looking at other medians and other industries. To explore this idea, we looked at cinema, that in 1 second, at 100 kilometres an hour, you travel at 27.78 metres a second. So if we look at cinema, standard cinema projects at 24 frames a second. Clay animation like Wallace and Gromit, you see 7 frames per second. So if we're trying to get, how do we get this perception out of the peripheral vision of the motorist that something is seamlessly moving on their side, if we can achieve 7 frames, then we might be able to do it. So we set the louvers at 4 metre spacings within 28, gives you 7 frames per second. We add the motorist and then we've got our audience. And again, the built outcome you see. So the clear acrylic screen that sits behind the louvers has a pattern on it. We had to put a pattern on it to reduce the, is that my 9 minutes? All right, I better hurry up. The sandblasted screen was to reduce traffic glare. And so what we did, working with Robert, Robert knew someone who could computer code from the 1960s, those punch cards. So we took all the botanical names of the grasses in the field, or the native grassland, and converted it to punch code and used that as the pattern on the wall. So in a way, the wall became a reflection, a true reflection of its environment. We also used computer gaming technology. We basically built a 3D model of it so we could drive up and down in the computer game to test to see if these things actually worked at speed. And we also used this computer game to test the nighttime effect. One of the aspects of the lighting was we wanted to work out how could we actually make this wall become a barometer of its environment. Vic Roads had to put magnetic loops in the road to measure traffic for traffic safety purposes and I guess predicting volumes further down the system. We worked out a way that we could connect a computer up and use their traffic data and convert that to light. So embedded in the acrylic wall is just a series of LED lights that can change colour, and by taking the volume of traffic that we record in the magnetic loops, we then basically convert that to light, so that as the road becomes busier, the lights become busier, and when the road's quiet, all the lights just rest in a blue colour. This is just the last image of the built work. As you come down onto the Western Ring Road, the louvers lean over and, in a way, sort of lie down to say goodbye. My favourite building is the next slide, and this I found very difficult because I'm not sure if I've got a favourite building. Tim's email said I had to pick a favourite building from Victoria. So the building I've picked is not so much because of its architecture, but because it's where it's located. If you look very carefully, on the knoll in the distance is a thing called the MUMC. It's the Melbourne Uni Mountaineering Engineering, the Melbourne Uni Mountaineering Club Hut. It's located 1,600 metres above sea level, above the snow line, on the northwest spur of Mount Feathertop. This photograph was taken from the Razorback Ridge, which is the other way of getting to it. It was built in the 1960s. It's a geodesic dome made out of aluminium with triangular windows. It's my favourite because there is no road to it. The only way you can get there is to walk, and the only way to walk there is either up the northwest spur or along the Razorback. What makes this building special is the journey to get to it and the experience of the landscape that surrounds you when you're on the top of Mount Feathertop in the Victorian High Plain.